The midday sun pounded the dusty plaza of Santa Fe, reflecting off weathered adobe walls and sending heat waves rippling across the crowd assembled for the autumn livestock auction. Merchants called out bargains while prospective buyers circled pens, anxious to claim the best horses before winter's cold. Amid the clamoring voices and clinking coins, the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the low murmur of human ambition intertwined with the relentless landscape. It was the sort of moment that coaxed desire from the earth and temptation from the heart. Silas Carter, a man as stoic and reserved as the high desert he called home, moved through the crowd with quiet purpose. At 35, his tall frame was wrapped in a weather-beaten coat, and a Stetson pulled low, shadowing eyes shaped by solitude. He rarely ventured into town except for supplies, or to trade a stout mare like the one standing in the corral, now ribs sharply outlined beneath its mahogany hide, but today his attention was fixed elsewhere. Behind the corral gate stood a girl no older than 19, wearing a faded dress frayed at the hem. Her bare feet sank into the earth, covered in dust, so pale it seemed to cling to her in ghostly devotion. She didn't speak, didn't cry, not audibly at least. Her dark eyes glimmered with a stillness that made the noise of the auction fade. Voices blurred into static. The sun's heat turned distant. All that remained was her silent and unwavering. A drunken man leaned forward, his bottle dangling from a trembling hand as he offered her like livestock. "Got a dumb one here," he shouted, voice thick with slurred cruelty. "Comes cheap, don't talk, don't hear, but cleans and cooks." The crowd jeered. Rough laughter punctuated the air as sartorial concern fell away. No one else in that moment saw what Silas saw. He saw loneliness echoing in that silent water. He saw recognition like looking into a weathered mirror reflecting his own isolation. The world around them was blasé, uninterested, even cruel. But she held his gaze like a beacon carved from resilience, something unspoken but profound. "A horse and her?" Then he said in a quiet voice, pressing coins into the man's hand. "Enough for a bay mare, nothing more an uneven bargain if bailment could be measured by compassion." The laughter rose louder, sharper. "You buying livestock or adopting ghosts?" someone barked. Silas did not answer. He simply waited for the transaction to conclude. The rope snapped as the man handed it over, mocking in his tone. "She's yours now. Don't go expectin' much. Ain't worth the dust on her toes." Silas guided the girl out of the pen. She followed soft footfalls, delicate presence like someone stepping from shadow into shape. They reached his wagon. He opened the back and she climbed inside, folding into the corner like she was woven from quiet threads. Then her hand came to rest on his coat, a gentle tug. No words, but an offering of trust. No thanks, no begging, only a simple gesture that said everything. Silas stiffened. Breath caught somewhere behind his ribs. The world felt too loud and still all at once. They rode out of Santa Fe together, wheels crunching on clay roads. She sat silent beneath a blanket as dust swirled against the wagon's sides. He stared straight ahead, though it was her silent presence that filled his vision. When dusk settled over the ridges and the sky spread wide and bare, the emptiness of the land felt less foreboding. At his isolated ranch, some miles away, she stepped down from the wagon, without a word, surveying the open fields, as if she owned each blade of grass by right. In the kitchen, Silas built a fire. She found tin cups and stirred water in a hush born of habit, not instruction, like she had always belonged by the hearth. After dinner, he handed her a piece of chalk, tapping the wooden doorframe by the table. "Name," he said softly. She studied him, then crouched chalk in delicate fingers. She wrote a single name, Emiline. He read it slowly, tasting the syllables as if they carried meaning beyond letters. No smile, no sound, but recognition filled the quiet room. In that moment, everything shifted. The auction's clamor felt like a distant echo, a prelude to this new reality they now shared. Silas recognized that letting her become part of his life would unravel everything he once knew. It would rewrite his solitude. It would demand empathy he had long hidden behind fences and routine. And yet, watching Emiline trace her name so fragile, yet so exact, he felt his own walls crumble. The world beyond that barn held threats, whispered rumors of her talent to perceive what others could not. Townspeople uneasy with her silence, fueled by ignorance and fear. But none of that mattered in that first night. All that mattered was the fragile spark between two silent souls meeting in a moment of unspoken connection. And somewhere beneath the embered glow of the fire, he knew this was only the beginning. A single act of compassion had kindled something too bright to ignore. And as the wind tapped against window panes, neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to. Not yet. Not when silence said so much more than words ever could. Life at the Carter ranch unfolded in a rhythm that spoke loudly without a single word. Dawn would find Silas straddling the porch steps in a deep breath of prairie air, the pale morning sky warming with promise. He'd refill the water troughs, check fence lines for breaks, and always glance back to see Emiline standing quietly at the barn gate, tracking his movements with eyes that seemed to take in more than any spoken directions could convey. Though she spoke no words, the unspoken language between them was richer than any cattle call or neighborly greeting could ever be. Silas taught her routine through gestures and gentle demonstrations. With hands shaped like weathered leather, he guided her palm over a saddle's seat, traced the arc of a bridle, bit through the air, and showed her how to read a horse's tension by the flicker of an ear or the set of a shoulder. She learned quickly, touching with intention, responding with grace. Prince, the younger gelding, would warm beneath her hand when she strolled past. The older mare Mahalia, once nervous around strangers, began to lean into her presence when Emiline stood by her flank. It was a miracle in two hearts, neither knowing how to say so. In the kitchen, they shared breakfast each day, coffee for Silas, warm oat porridge for her. Emiline, ever dutiful, cleared and washed dishes with quiet efficiency. The clink of a spoon on the bowl marked their only shared sound, but it rang deeper than conversation. When spring blooms pushed through prairie grass, Silas would gather wildflowers in dusty jugs. Emiline arranged them in the kitchen windowsill, shifting petals until the light shone through, casting fractured rainbows across the wooden wall. That silent collaboration became their ritual, a melody written only in action. Neighbors, initially wary, began to notice the grain of their companionship. Tom Weaver, the ranch hand, arrived one afternoon with a limping colt that no farrier could steady. Emiline, watching the colt's eyes flicker with pain, simply knelt beside it, pressing her cool palm to the swollen hock. Tom watched uncertain, then sat back in wonder as the colt calmed its gait, easing within hours. Word traveled in quiet whispers, that silenced girl. Soon a widow arrived with her infant, tethered at the hand, exhausted and fearful. Emiline took the child into the kitchen, hummed gently before her voice, people said, while Silas prepared herb tea. The baby slept, and the mother wept tears of astonishment. No word passed between Emiline and the mother, and still on that bench under the cottonwood they lingered in peaceful companionship, an echo without sound. Summer days bled into September, and the harvest brought a swell of chores. Silas mounted Emiline on Prince for the first time, a moment she'd anticipated with a mixture of excitement and caution. She settled into the saddle with quiet dignity, hand pressed to Silas's back as he guided the horse gently toward open fields. Dust rose around them like soft applause. They spent afternoons surveying land, repairing fences together, her small hand tucked in his weathered one as they worked. Where once silence felt lonely, now it felt sacred and full. But life under open skies carries risk. One afternoon, a raging storm rolled in faster than forecast or wisdom could predict. Wind pulled at the rafters of the barn, rain hissed like angry iron against roofs, and lightning split the sky with feral claws. Without warning, a beam cracked near the stall housing the pregnant cow. Emiline, ever in tune, bolted from the house, her eyes wide but composed. She raced to the barn, waving her arms in rhythm as if conducting the wind. Silas followed, heart pounding, fearing collapse. Instead, the beam groaned and snapped free landing inches from the cow and not on top of her. Thunder receded, and silence reigned once more. They stooped together beneath the roof's shadow, hearts pounding, and in that instant, wordless, they understood all the power that presence can hold. As autumn's gold tipped to rust, Silas recognized the walls of their partnership. That winter they built a small room off the kitchened shelter haven sanctuary. Silas hammered timbers, Emiline sanded walls and draped them with blankets. The new space, warmed by a small stove, became their shared refuge on long evenings. He'd read from letters sent by an old schoolmate stories about distant cities and fallen empires. She'd finger over the pages, tracing letters she didn't know, but recognizing the heartbeat behind their author's pen. Their companionship grew not on sound, but on comprehension, a union formed by touch trust and unspoken devotion. In Santa Fe, rumors persisted, whispers that silence equaled secrets, wariness that Emiline's presence might be unnatural. But the people who mattered began to see differently. When the harvest fair came that fall, it was Silas who marched forward, Emiline walking beside him. She accepted their offered quilt, her acceptance measured not in words but in grace. Townfolk who once averted their eyes offered gentle nods. Children, curious and unafraid, lingered to touch her hand, to feel the calm that radiated from her. She knelt before the prize stall to stroke the winning filly's nose, then rose and met their eyes, not speaking but speaking volumes. And at night, in the quiet hush of their home, Silas would place his palm on Emiline's chest, and she would mirror the gesture on his heart. In that shared silence lay years of understanding, a life built on trust, composed of absence and presence, form and stillness. No words could capture it. No clamor could diminish it. They had built a life without echo, but one that rang clear in every gesture, every glance, every unspoken promise. And as autumn bled into the first snow, they understood this wordless world they had forged together was full of love, deeper than any spoken vow, steadier than any oath. And that more than speech was the echo that would outlast them both. The first time Silas and Emiline set foot in the town square as a pair, there was an undercurrent of hushed anticipation. Folks leaned into their doorways, harsh whispers, while they waited to see some out of curiosity, others out of pure skepticism. It was as though the wind carried rumors from one end of the dusty street to the other, reaching the ears of every shopkeeper and passer-by. She's different. They needed a story they could understand, and kindness without words was harder to place than any wanderer or gambler with a wild tale. A meeting was convened in the old church, its wooden beams echoing centuries of spoken prayer. But now the silence was heavier than hymns. Silas and Emiline entered together side by side. She wore a modest shawl he had woven for her, threads flecked with sunlight. He knew this would stir whispers, some would call it scandal, others grace, but he refused to walk in front of her alone. Reverend Thomas, whose warm sermons had once soothed the town's aching hearts, stood at the pulpit. He cleared his throat, eyes flicking between Silas and the rows of uneasy congregants. "We gather today," he began in measured tones, "to decide whether this union we see before us lifts our town or casts a shadow we cannot bear." The question hung low, heavy with more than suspicion. It carried the weight of every unspoken prejudice buried in their hearts. Silas felt Emiline's hand slip into his, her fingers soft but steady. She drew strength from touch and gave it back to him. He raised her hand gently, showing everyone the pair belonged together not by convention, but by something deeper. One by one, townsfolk stood. Mrs. Withers, who first spoke words of caution, asked in trembling voice, "How can a woman who hears no thunder and speaks no word know what lies ahead for our people?" She trembled, but more from curiosity than spite. Silas answered simply, "She listens." That one word clung in the space between them, resonating with unexpected clarity. An elderly farmer, his coat lined with decades of winter dust, remembered Emiline's care when his fever-stricken grandson lay burning. He said she brought comfort. I heard no prayer, but I felt relief. Another voice followed Tom Weaver, who had first seen her heal. The colt spoke without hesitation. "She's saved more than flesh. She's preserved faith in something we thought lost." Tensions swelled. The preacher asked Emiline to speak something concrete to reassure them. She stood still and composed. She raised trembling fingers against her chest and spelled the old prayer in sign language, a familiar hymn, its motion etched more in memory than sound. The congregation gasped. The silent hymn moved through her hands as powerfully as any vocal verse. Reverend Thomas's eyes glistened. Faith, he rasped, may not need voice to speak. That moment shifted the tide. A mother stepped forward, tears brimming, saying, "If she can find God in silence, perhaps we've misunderstood what his voice can sound like." Each heart in the room pausing, letting new understanding settle. They did not vote. There was no formal decree. Instead, they stepped back. The whispers slowed. Murmurs of acceptance threaded through the crowd, tender and deliberate. Silence no longer felt like judgment. It started to carry respect. Over the following weeks, the town's cautious curiosity evolved into quiet trust. Emiline made visits, tending the school's classroom garden, sharing her silent teaching with children brave enough to ask. She ran her hands along the rough-hewn desks, then left a fist-shaped indentation in damp soil for seeds, gentle lessons in growth without words. Parents observed the students learning patience, understanding, listening not just with ears, but with hearts. Silas often stood near the edge of gatherings at market stalls or the blacksmith's forge, his gaze fixed on Emiline as she moved among people with poised serenity. He felt the weight of their acceptance and the fragility of the trust they'd granted. Once a stranger came to the inn, a traveling trader with questions about price. He found Emiline quietly beside him, her hands tracing price tags on leather goods. She pressed a hand to the trader's arm, then to her chest, then pointed to the goods, again indicating satisfaction. The man nodded, slowly, smiled, and left astonished that he had found agreement without a single spoken word between them. Not all fear vanished. Some wagged guarded tongues at the saloon bar, questioning whether Emiline's silence masked deception. But when Silas went one evening to escort her home, they saw him offer her his arm, steady presence, unwavering respect. That simple gesture told more than any rumor could. Threats turned to grudging acceptance. By Christmas, the town's annual candlelit service included an invitation Emiline would light the final candle. As dusk fell over Main Street, all gathered in the snow-muffled hush. Reverend Thomas stepped aside with phrasing of blessing, and Emiline approached the candlestick, came to Silas's side, then reached out her hand. He guided hers to the flame, but it was her firm fingers that lifted the candle, steady flame, burning bright. As the light illuminated her face, no sound was needed in that single flicker of flame. Acceptance glowed. Silas squeezed her hand, and beyond them the town exhaled. Peace had not been spoken. It had been lit into being. They returned home under a sky full of stars, snow crunching beneath boots. Silas glanced at Emiline, feeling her warmth in every step. He knew this moment would echo in their days to come, proof that fear may whisper, but faith can answer with silence louder than any sermon. In the hush that surrounded them, Silas spoke once welcome home, and it felt as sacred and resonant as any hymn. The wind had begun to shift by the time the cottonwood leaves turned amber. The world was not louder, it had never been, but somehow more attuned, as if every whisper on the ranch, every gust through the stable rafters carried something more than just air. It carried presence, meaning, belonging. For Silas, the transformation was subtle, like the changing of seasons. He no longer questioned her place, not in his home, not in his heart, not in this land they shared. She belonged the way water does to a riverbed, the way stars belong to the dark. Mornings came earlier now with Emiline lighting the stove before the sun broke. She had taken to writing a single sentence on the kitchen chalkboard every dawn, observations, prayers, or simply truths. The air smells like snow. Prince favors the north pasture. You are not alone. Each one written with care, her letters curving with quiet strength. Silas began replying first with awkward chalk strokes, then with gestures she'd taught him. His fingers were clumsy stiff from years of ranch work, but she never laughed. When he made a sign wrong, she'd gently correct him, her fingers guiding his like a teacher shaping language from touch. In those lessons, laughter came easier, so did joy. One evening, as dusk settled, Silas brought Emiline to the bench beneath the cottonwood where he once sat alone. He held something behind his back, a small wooden box with a velvet lining, and inside it, not a ring, but something deeper. He handed her the box, eyes never leaving hers. Inside was a necklace, simple rawhide thread strung through a carved silver charm. The symbol etched on it wasn't a name, nor a symbol of wealth, but a sign they had created together, the shape her hand made over her heart the first time she'd shown him trust. A gesture. A vow. Emiline's breath caught. She reached up, pressed the charm to her chest, and then placed her palm gently over his heart. No words passed between them, and none were needed. She wore it every day after that. As winter deepened, Silas fell ill, something between exhaustion and fever. He'd pushed too hard for too long repairing fences before the snow. Emiline tended to him like a seasoned healer. She brewed teas from rabbit tobacco and sage, cooled his brow with cloth soaked in river mint. But it wasn't the herbs that soothed him. It was her silence, the rhythm of her presence beside him. She never left his side even when sleep pulled her toward the hearth. Her chair remained at his bedside, her hand resting lightly on his wrist, a quiet drumbeat keeping time with his recovery. One morning, when the fever broke, he woke to see her asleep with her head on the mattress, one hand still clasping his. His whispered voice cracked and hoarse. "Thank you," though he knew she couldn't hear. But her eyes fluttered open and she smiled. He didn't need to say it again. It was in that long, quiet recovery that he asked her through signs he'd practiced in the dark, "Will you stay, always?" She didn't answer immediately. She only stood cross to the chalkboard and wrote, "I already have." That winter, children from town began arriving in pairs or small groups. They came not just for Silas's stories or chores, but for Emiline. They'd sit in the warmth of the small added room drawing, while she showed them how to press their palms into the soil of potted plants, or how to read the body of a horse without pulling reins or shouting commands. Some were shy, some bold, but all found in her a new kind of teacher. She didn't teach with structure. She taught with attention, with presence, with touch. And when they'd go home, they'd tell their parents, "She made me feel like I mattered." One mother confided to Silas that her boy, once labeled slow and difficult, had blossomed after just a few visits. "She speaks to something in them," she said, "and not even with her hands, just by listening." The ranch became a place of stories not told but understood, belonging not granted but grown. Even the town changed. Mrs. Withers began sending pies. The preacher invited Emiline to light the first candle of Advent. At the market, no one turned away when she passed. Yet Silas knew belonging didn't mean comfort always. It meant honesty. One cold afternoon he brought her to the edge of the north pasture near the stone marking his father's grave. He had never spoken to her of the blood that stained that land, how it came to be theirs, through war, silence, and loss. He pointed to the grave, then signed slowly, "My shame lives there." She stepped forward, traced the name carved in the stone, then turned to him, placed his hand to her heart, and signed, "Your future lives here." He broke then, not from guilt but release. She had not erased his past. She had given him space to forgive it. That night, Silas sat by the fire and wrote one word on a page he kept in his desk for years, untouched. Home. She found it the next morning and taped it to the chalkboard. Below it, she added in soft, slanted writing, "For both of us." Years passed, like pages of a book too precious to close. Seasons wove themselves into the fabric of daily life rains that softened the earth frost that kissed the barn rafters, and dawns that painted new hopes across the horizon. Time, however, never moved quickly on Silas's ranch. It lingered gentle and steady, like the silence that had always lived between him and Emiline. The children who had once crouched beside Emiline to learn the language of patience now returned with their own little ones. They spoke of her the way one speaks of the sky or mountains, something ever present, always watching, always listening. They called her the woman who heard without ears, who touched lives with silence, and stitched community together with nothing more than kindness. Silas's hair turned silver first. He worked slower but not less. And Emiline moved as she always had, quiet as snowfall, soft as dusk. She had not aged in the way others did. Her silence seemed to have preserved something eternal in her. She still wrote notes on the chalkboard, still tended the horses, still brewed tea from dried herbs gathered on cool mornings. But something had shifted, something quieter than sorrow, gentler than fear. One evening, after fixing a loose fence board, Silas stood by the cottonwood bench watching the sun dip low, casting gold over the land they had called home. Emiline joined him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I want them to remember this," he said, his voice hushed. "This life. You." She looked up at him, her eyes lit by the fading sun. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a worn piece of paper folded many times over. It was the note he had written to her during the fever years ago. "I want to hear your heart if you'll let me listen with mine." She had kept it all this time, not because she needed proof, but because it reminded her of the moment someone saw her not as broken, but whole. Silas kissed her temple gently. He didn't need to say more. When spring returned, the land bloomed fiercely as if in defiance of time. But Silas's steps grew shorter. He rested more. One day, he didn't rise before dawn as he always did. Emiline found him asleep in his chair by the fire, a journal on his lap filled with entries about weather patterns, folding schedules, and quiet reflections of days with her. She didn't weep. Not then. She held his hand and sat beside him in the hush of the morning, her heart echoing the rhythm that once belonged to his. The town came to the ranch in waves, people who had known them for decades, some who had once feared her, others who had learned to love because of her. They didn't ask questions. They brought meals, trimmed hedges, whispered memories into the wind, as if it might carry them to Silas. And Emiline, she continued. She didn't retreat. She opened the gates wider. Children still came. She showed them how to press their palms to the earth and feel the weather change. She taught them how to listen, not for sound, but for truth, for presence, for understanding. One evening, the preacher's granddaughter asked her, "How do you know what someone means if they don't say it?" Emiline took the girl's hand and laid it on her own chest. because we feel she signed. The bench beneath the cottonwood never stood empty. Emiline sat there each evening watching the sun bleed color into the hills. She didn't wait for anything. She simply belonged. She wore the silver charm around her neck until the day she passed it on to a girl who reminded her of herself. A girl who rarely spoke but wrote poetry no one else understood. Emiline gave her the charm and whispered with her hands, "You hear what others miss. That is a gift. Never hide it." Years from that moment when the girl was grown, a book appeared in the Santa Fe market stalls. It was bound in soft leather etched with a cottonwood leaf and titled The Quiet Legacy. Inside were not stories written in ink, but illustrations of gestures of weather changes of the way horses respond to soft breath. On the last page was a single sentence, "Real love does not demand to be heard. It simply listens and stays." And below that a drawing of a hand resting over a heart. The townspeople never spoke of Emiline in the past tense. Her presence was stitched into the fabric of their lives like dawn or snowfall, or the hush before prayer. They didn't need to say her name aloud to feel what she had left behind. As for Silas, his name rested beside hers on a smooth river stone beneath the cottonwood. No epitaph, no dates, just two carved symbols side by side, a hand and a heart. Love beyond words, and a silence that still speaks.